It was a quiet evening in the small, forgotten town of Edgewood, New Mexico. The sky stretched out in a blanket of faded purple, the last remnants of daylight clinging to the horizon, like a memory that was soon to fade. The air was thick with the smell of desert dust, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and something else. Something almost metallic, like blood on hot steel. The wind whispered secrets that no one dared to listen to, swirling through the narrow streets and rattling the old, weathered buildings that had long been abandoned by life, leaving them to rot in silence. Most of the town's people had moved away over the years, lured by promises of work and opportunity in the bustling cities. Edgewood had become a ghost of itself, a place where only the bravest or most foolish chose to remain. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They could feel it in the air, as though the very land itself was steeped in a dark presence, something older than the town. The sun had long since disappeared, and the town was bathed in the eerie glow of streetlights that flickered in and out like unreliable sentinels. The few remaining souls who called Edgewood home stayed inside their homes after dark, their doors bolted shut and windows covered with thick curtains. They knew better than to wander the streets after sunset. There were whispers of strange noises in the night, of footsteps that didn't belong to anyone, of shadows that slithered beneath the cracks of doors, and eyes that glinted from the darkness. But whenever anyone dared to speak of it, they were quickly silenced by fearful glances and hurried gestures to change the subject. Some things, it seemed, were better left unsaid. They said the land was cursed, haunted by the memories of a man whose name was only whispered in the darkest corners of town. Samuel the Torturer. Years ago, he had been a quiet man, someone who kept to himself, living in a dilapidated shack on the outskirts of Edgewood. He was never much of a presence in the town, just another forgotten face among many. But after the first disappearance, things started to change. It was as if the land itself had shifted, and with it, the fragile peace that had once existed. The first time someone had gone missing, people tried to explain it away. A runaway, perhaps. Someone who had just had enough of the dead-end town and decided to leave. No note, no goodbye. But when the second person disappeared, this time it was a child, the whispers began. They couldn't ignore it anymore. The disappearances were too frequent, too sudden, and they left behind nothing but a cold, lingering sense of dread. It was at that point that the stories about Samuel started to circulate. They said he had a darkness inside him, something twisted and cruel, something that thrived in the silence of the desert. Those who had known him claimed that there was a strange look in his eyes, a hunger that was never satisfied, no matter how much he consumed. They spoke of him in hushed tones, careful not to speak too loudly, lest the man himself hear them. Some even said that Samuel had been born to the land, that he had been chosen by something ancient and malevolent, that called the desert home. But what terrified the people the most wasn't just Samuel's unsettling presence. It was what happened after the first few disappearances. People started hearing strange noises at night. At first, it was just a low, distant thumping sound, like the beat of a drum, echoing across the desert. But as the nights passed, the sounds grew louder, more insistent. It was almost as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with them, to warn them. But every time they went outside to investigate, there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of life. Only the rustling of dry leaves and the occasional screech of a distant owl. Then the figures started to appear. It was always in the corner of their eyes, just outside their field of vision. People would catch glimpses of someone standing at the edge of the road or in the windows of abandoned buildings, their faces hidden in shadow. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there. Just empty streets and the heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And the worst part, those who went out at night never came back. They didn't even leave behind a trace of their existence, as though they had been erased from the world entirely. The townspeople didn't know what to make of it. Some said the land itself was punishing them for staying too long. Others believed the spirits of the missing had returned to claim more victims, trapped in the purgatory of Edgewood. But there were a few who whispered darker thoughts. Thoughts of Samuel and the strange things that had started happening ever since he arrived. It wasn't long before rumors began to circulate that Samuel had been more than just a man. They said he had a power over people, a way of making them do things they would never have done otherwise. Some believed he had learned dark rituals from the desert itself, ancient rites that gave him control over life and death. Others said he had been marked by something evil, something that made him a predator, a hunter who never stopped. The stories grew more and more elaborate, each telling more horrifying than the last. Some said Samuel didn't just kill his victims. He tortured them first, dragging them through unimaginable pain and fear before ending their lives. Others claimed that he had a lair deep in the hills, a place where he kept the bodies of his victims, surrounded by strange symbols and objects that hinted at the twisted rituals he performed. The more people talked, the more they began to believe that Samuel wasn't just a man. He was a force, something born of the land, something that would never die, no matter how many years passed. Edgewood had become a place of fear, a place where the shadows were always watching, and the wind carried with it the echoes of the lost. And though most of the town had fled, there were a few who stayed, people who couldn't leave, who were too deeply rooted in the soil of Edgewood to ever escape. They tried to warn others, but their voices were lost in the wind, drowned out by the growing darkness that seemed to consume everything in its path. But one thing was certain: the terror was far from over. The whispers that filled the air at night, the feeling of eyes watching from the shadows, these were only the beginning. The land had been marked by something terrible, something that had once been human, but was now something much worse. And as long as Samuel's name was remembered, as long as his memory lingered on the wind, Edgewood would never be free. It all started with a girl named Emily. She was 18, the kind of girl whose smile could light up a room, whose laughter could bring life to even the most quiet corners of Edgewood. Emily had big dreams, dreams of escaping the clutches of the small town she had grown up in, of finding something bigger, something brighter, beyond the endless stretches of desert. She had plans to leave. She had told everyone she would. And in the weeks leading up to that fateful night, she had been counting down the days. The thought of leaving Edgewood had given her hope. But little did she know, the very thing she was running from was already waiting for her. On that particular night, the air in Edgewood had a strange chill to it. It wasn't the usual desert coolness that swept in after sunset, but something else. A heaviness, an unspoken warning in the breeze. Emily had finished a long shift at the local gas station, a job that was barely enough to cover her rent, and decided she needed a break. She needed to clear her mind before heading back home to pack her bags. She had plans to leave the next morning. So, she made her way to the old diner on the corner of Main Street. The diner was a relic of Edgewood's past, a place that had been serving coffee and pie to locals for decades. The neon sign flickered weakly in the distance, casting an eerie glow across the empty street. It was almost as if the diner itself was too tired to keep going. Emily sat in her usual booth, near the window that overlooked the empty street. She ordered a late-night coffee, just like she always did when she was trying to shake off the lingering sadness of the day. The coffee came, bitter and hot, and she took a slow sip as the sound of the radio filled the space with soft, nostalgic tunes. The place was nearly empty, just the soft hum of the coffee machine and the occasional clink of dishes from the kitchen. The old waitress, Margie, gave her a friendly smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. There was something off about that night, something neither of them could put into words. Margie had seen Emily many times before, seen her as she dreamed of getting away, as she talked about how she would make it in the world, as she plotted her escape from Edgewood. She had always been kind to the girl, though she had her own reservations about the dangerous notion of leaving a small town like this. Margie had grown up in Edgewood, and though she never loved it, she had always felt there was a certain safety in staying put. But as she poured Emily's coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a tension in the air, a coldness that was deeper than the usual desert night. Emily sat there, lost in thought, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. She had no idea that this night would be her last. No idea that the town's long-hidden horrors were about to catch up with her. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. She had planned to head home soon and begin packing. Her mind was already on the new life she would soon begin. But as she stood up to pay, the bell above the diner door jingled, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The door opened just enough for a gust of wind to blow in, the chill biting at her skin. Emily froze for a moment, her eyes darting to the dark silhouette standing in the doorway. For a brief second, she thought she saw something shift in the shadows, a figure watching her from the dark. The door closed, and the figure was gone. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. She turned to the waitress, Margie, but Margie was already busy wiping down the counter, oblivious to the strange feeling in the air. Emily tried to shake off the unease that was building inside her, but it lingered, gnawing at her thoughts. She paid for her coffee and stepped out into the cool night, the street lamp above flickering as she walked toward her car. The wind had picked up, and the town seemed quieter than usual. As she walked down the deserted street, the shadows of the old buildings stretched across the road like long, twisting fingers. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up again. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A strange noise echoed from the dark. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but then it grew louder, almost like footsteps, following her. Emily quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She glanced over her shoulder, but saw nothing. The street was empty. Still, that feeling remained. Someone was there, just out of sight. She reached her car, her hand trembling as she fumbled for the keys in her pocket. She slid into the driver's seat and locked the door, but the unease wouldn't leave her. She tried to shake it off and started the engine, the sound of the car's rumbling engine breaking the silence. She pulled away from the diner, driving down the empty road that led to the outskirts of town. As she passed the last row of houses, she glanced up at the hills in the distance. For a split second, she thought she saw something. A figure standing on the hilltop, watching her. It was so brief, so faint, that she wondered if it had just been her imagination. But the feeling didn't leave. She couldn't help but glance in the rear-view mirror, but the road behind her was empty. She drove faster now, eager to get home and forget about the strange feeling that clung to her. But as she turned a corner, something caught her eye, a shadow darting in and out of view. Her heart began to race. She pressed her foot harder on the accelerator, her mind racing, her breath shallow. The shadow was following her. She could feel it, closing in, creeping closer with each turn. She slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching on the gravel as she skidded to a stop. The car lurched, and she took a deep breath, hands clutching the wheel. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew something was terribly wrong. The street was empty again. just the silent stretch of road ahead. But as she stared into the darkness, she heard it, the softest whisper, a voice that wasn't hers, calling her name from the night. Emily. The world around her seemed to spin as she looked around, panic surging through her veins. She had to go. She had to get out of there. She slammed the car into drive and sped off, not looking back. She didn't see the shadow that had been following her, didn't see the figure lurking in the darkness of the hills. And next morning, when they found her car abandoned on the side of the road, the town was already whispering about what had happened. Some claimed they had seen a figure watching from the hills. Others said they heard screams in the night. But Emily was gone. No trace, no sign of struggle. Just an empty car and the cold, empty road. And with that, the terror that had long been lying dormant in Edgewood began to wake. The first victim had disappeared, and the town could no longer pretend that everything was fine. The fear, like a slow-moving storm, began to settle over Edgewood, leaving everyone on edge. Everyone was asking the same question: who would be next? Over the years, Samuel's legend grew, becoming something far more terrifying than the town of Edgewood could have ever anticipated. What began as a series of hushed whispers passed along in fearful glances and nervously spoken words, gradually transformed into something much darker. Stories of his cruelty circulated like wildfire, spreading through the few remaining souls in the town who had yet to leave. The name Samuel was uttered with dread, a symbol of an unrelenting terror that had no end. People said he was a man of unimaginable cruelty, someone whose thirst for suffering was as endless as the desert surrounding Edgewood. They spoke of the twisted satisfaction he took in torturing his victims, of how he would drag them through unspeakable horrors before finally taking their lives. But it wasn't just the brutality of his actions that made the people of Edgewood tremble in fear. It was the fact that no one ever escaped him. No one who had ever crossed Samuel's path had managed to walk away. His victims, once they fell into his grasp, were swallowed by the darkness without leaving a trace, their cries for mercy lost to the winds. What terrified the town the most was the chilling realization that Samuel didn't just kill. He controlled. He had a dark power, something no one could explain, a sinister influence that seemed to reach into the very minds of his victims. Some said that Samuel could make people forget, erasing the memories of what he did to them, locking them in a terrifying fog of confusion and disorientation. Those who managed to escape, even for a short while, found that their memories of the horrors they had experienced would slip away the moment they tried to recall them. It was as though Samuel had the power to tamper with their minds, to rob them of their ability to remember, leaving them lost in a fog of incomprehension. They would catch brief, fleeting glimpses of what had happened, But every time they tried to understand the full scope of the terror, the memories would vanish, slipping away like grains of sand through their fingers. The more they spoke of him, the more his power seemed to grow. The stories became more elaborate, more surreal. Some said Samuel had eyes everywhere, watching from the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness, any moment when someone dared to venture too far from the safety of their homes. It didn't matter where you were or what you did. Samuel was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of your vision, ready to strike when you least expected it. People began to believe that the land itself was his domain, that the hills and the desert were part of him, and that anyone who ventured too deep would be claimed by him, lost to the wilderness without a trace. Samuel was no longer just a man. He was a force, a dark presence that permeated the very air they breathed. It was as if he was a living nightmare that existed beyond the constraints of reality, a specter that could reach into the hearts of anyone who dared to defy him. The stories of Samuel's cruelty took on a life of their own. Some spoke of him as a man who enjoyed inflicting pain for the sheer pleasure of it, while others claimed he was driven by something darker, something far beyond the understanding of ordinary people. They said that his torment didn't stop at death, that his victims' souls were trapped in the desert, wandering the hills, forever tormented by the memories of what had been done to them. It was as though Samuel had become the embodiment of the desert's wrath, a figure whose very existence was tied to the cruelty and isolation of the land. Over time, Edgewood became a town living in fear, with its residents shrinking into their homes, never daring to go out after dark. Those who remained in the town had no choice but to live with the legend, with the knowledge that Samuel could be anywhere, watching them. The nights grew colder, darker, and the wind carried with it the whispers of lost souls. People began to speak in hushed tones, always careful not to draw attention to the horrors that were unfolding around them. Every rustle of the wind, every distant creak of an old building was a reminder that Samuel was still out there, still watching. The fear that gripped the town was palpable, and even the bravest of souls found themselves unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was always lurking just beyond their reach. As the years passed, the disappearances continued. They were no longer isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that no one could explain. The stories of Samuel's victims, those who had vanished into the night, became part of the town's grim history. It seemed like every year someone else would go missing. No one ever saw them leave. No one ever heard a scream, and yet they were never seen again. It was as though the town itself was being erased, one person at a time, by the dark force that Samuel had become. The few remaining townsfolk spoke of him as though he were something supernatural, a being that was not bound by the same rules as mortal men. Samuel's presence in Edgewood became so pervasive that people began to believe the town itself was cursed, a place where the very land seemed to be under the thrall of his darkness. Every shadow, every flicker of light, seemed to be a reminder of his reach, and every sound in the night carried with it the faint echo of his power. People spoke of the hills around the town with fear, as though the very earth beneath their feet was tainted by Samuel's malevolent influence. They said that anyone who dared venture too far beyond the town's borders would never return, that Samuel would claim them as his own, just as he had claimed so many others. And yet, despite the ever-growing terror, no one ever dared to confront him. The legend of Samuel had become so deeply ingrained in the minds of the townspeople that they no longer thought it possible to escape his grasp. They had resigned themselves to the fact that they lived in a place where the laws of reality no longer applied, where a man, or whatever Samuel had become, could control their very existence, stealing their memories and their lives. Fear had taken root in their hearts, and with it came the sense that no matter how hard they tried, they would never be able to break free from the shadow of Samuel's influence. As the years wore on, the fear only deepened. Children grew up hearing the stories, the warnings, and they learned to fear the hills, the darkness, and the very name of Samuel. The town, once a place of hope and opportunity, had become a place where fear was a constant companion, always lurking in the corners of every conversation, in the eyes of every passerby. Samuel's legend had become a part of Edgewood's identity, woven into the very fabric of the town itself, and no one ever dared to question it, because deep down, they all knew that the legend was real. They knew that Samuel was out there, watching, waiting, and that no one, no matter how brave or foolish, would ever escape him. It wasn't until a man named Jacob returned to Edgewood that the truth finally came out. A truth that had been buried under years of fear and silence. Jacob had been one of the few who had escaped Samuel's grip, a rare survivor in a town filled with victims who were never seen again. His return, however, did not bring relief or comfort. Instead, it brought a chill, a deep sense of dread that settled over the town like a thick fog. The man who returned was not the same man who had left. Jacob had been found in the desert, broken and near death, stumbling across the dry landscape as if guided by some invisible force. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, his clothes torn and caked with dirt. His eyes, once full of hope and life, were now vacant, haunted by something unspeakable. It had taken the search party days to find him, and when they finally did, they barely recognized him. The man who had once been full of life, with dreams of something better, had been reduced to a shell of himself, a man who could barely speak or stand on his own. When they brought him back to town, The people of Edgewood were hesitant to approach. They had heard the rumors, the stories about the cursed man who had returned from the desert. Some were afraid he had been touched by the same evil that had claimed the others. Others simply didn't know what to make of it. But as Jacob lay in the dimly lit town clinic, his body and mind slowly beginning to heal, the people of Edgewood knew they would have to face what had been hidden for so long. It was one evening, after the sun had set and the cool desert air had begun to settle in, that Jacob gathered the courage to speak. He had been silent for days, lying on the cot in the corner of the clinic, staring at the ceiling with a haunted expression. The town's doctor, a kind but weary man named Dr. Thompson, had tried to ask him questions, but Jacob would barely respond. It wasn't until a quiet evening when the clinic was nearly empty that Jacob finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper.
It was like he knew every move I'd make before I did, Jacob said, his voice trembling with the memory. It was as if he was everywhere, watching, waiting. The words sent a shiver down Dr. Thompson's spine. The doctor had heard the stories about Samuel, but hearing them from someone who had lived through it, someone who had actually escaped, was something else entirely. Jacob's eyes, once wide with panic, now seemed distant, as if the man was trying to escape the horrors of his past by retreating into himself. I couldn't get away from him, Jacob continued, his voice breaking. It didn't matter how far I ran or where I hid. He was always there, in the shadows, just watching. And then, when I thought I had found a way out, he'd make me believe I was free. He'd make me believe I could escape. But every time I tried, I'd end up back at the beginning. It was like a game to him. A cruel game. And I was the prize. Jacob's words were thick with fear, but there was also something else in them. Something deeper, a kind of horror. It wasn't just about the physical pain Samuel had inflicted. It was the mental torment, the psychological manipulation that Jacob had suffered. Samuel wasn't just a man. He was a force, a presence that bent reality itself to its will. He could control the very minds of those he pursued, twisting their thoughts, making them doubt their own senses, and convincing them they were trapped in a never-ending cycle of terror. I don't know how long it lasted, Jacob said, his voice hollow, his eyes unfocused. Days? Weeks? I lost track of time. It felt like I was in a nightmare that never ended. I'd wake up in different places I didn't remember going. I'd think I was out of the woods, but then I'd see him again. Samuel, standing in the distance, watching me, and every time I'd try to run, but it was like I was running in circles, like the land itself was trying to hold me in place. Dr. Thompson stood in silence, watching as Jacob struggled to find the words. He knew there were things Jacob couldn't or wouldn't say, things that were better left unsaid. But the doctor also knew that Jacob's story was not just about one man. It was about the horror that had haunted Edgewood for so long. A terror that had been hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come to light. Jacob paused, taking a shaky breath, before he continued, his voice growing weaker as the memories.
I saw things, Jacob whispered. Things I can't explain. Shadows moving on their own. Voices calling my name. And every time I turned, he was there, in the corner of my vision, always just out of reach. I could hear him laughing sometimes. It was the kind of laugh that made your skin crawl. Like he was enjoying the game. Enjoying my fear. The doctor's heart sank as he listened to Jacob's words. The terror that Samuel had inflicted wasn't just physical. It was psychological, deeply twisted. Samuel's influence had seeped into every corner of Jacob's mind, slowly unraveling his sense of reality, forcing him to confront his deepest fears, making him question everything he thought he knew. Samuel had become an omnipresent force, a shadow that stretched across every moment of Jacob's existence. And Jacob was just one of many who had been touched by that darkness. Finally, Jacob looked at Dr. Thompson, his eyes wide with panic, his breath shallow. You have to warn them, he said, his voice urgent. If you're ever in those hills at night, don't look back, because he's watching. He's always watching. And if you turn around, if you even think about turning around, you're already lost. Jacob's warning hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the nightmare that still lurked beyond the town's borders. The doctor nodded. Oh, he knew that it wasn't just a warning for the people of Edgewood. It was a warning for himself as well. He had heard the stories, the rumors of Samuel, but hearing it from someone who had experienced it firsthand was something different, something that couldn't be ignored. As Jacob's story came to an end, Dr. Thompson knew that the town would never be the same. The truth was out now, and the darkness that had haunted Edgewood for so long was no longer a shadow. It was a living, breathing nightmare that had a name, a face, and a power that no one could escape. Jacob's survival was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, but it was also a reminder of how fragile that spirit could be in the face of something as malevolent as Samuel. As the doctor left the clinic that night, the cold desert air biting at his skin, he couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel's presence was still out there, watching, waiting. And as the wind whispered through the streets of Edgewood, it carried with it the faintest echo of laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that reminded him that the nightmare was far from over. One fateful night, a group of friends, curious and braver than they should have been, decided to venture into the hills surrounding Edgewood. They had heard the stories, of course, the rumors about Samuel, the torturer, who had terrorized the town for years. But they were skeptical, just like everyone else who had never truly experienced the horror themselves. To them, the stories seemed like nothing more than myths. Fabrications made up to keep people away from the land that had once been full of life. These were just stories of lost souls and ghostly figures, nothing more than the superstitions of small-town folk. They didn't believe in such things. They were young, full of bravado, and eager to prove that they weren't afraid of the hills or the legend that had gripped their town for so long. There were 5 of them in total. Jake, the unofficial leader of the group, always quick to push boundaries. Sarah, the adventurous one who could never resist a challenge. Mike, the quiet thinker who had his doubts but never voiced them. Lisa, the skeptic who was sure that any rumors about Samuel were just the result of overactive imaginations. And Ben, the wild one, always up for anything, always the first to suggest the next daring escapade. Together, they made their way to the hills, laughing and joking as they walked, their voices carrying through the cool night air. The night was eerily calm as they left the safety of Edgewood behind, walking deeper into the shadowed landscape. The moon, a thin sliver of silver in the sky, did little to illuminate the dark path ahead. The landscape was harsh, full of jagged rocks and twisted trees that seemed to loom over them like silent sentinels. The farther they ventured, the quieter the night became. The wind, which had been whispering through the trees as they left the town, seemed to pick up, its eerie hum growing louder as they climbed higher into the hills. "Stop being such babies," Jake laughed, pushing his friends forward. "There's nothing here but rocks and dirt. You guys are all just spooked by some old stories. Come on, let's get to the top and get a good view of the town." But even as he spoke, there was a strange tension in the air, a sense of unease that no one could quite place. At first, they tried to ignore it, brushing it off as nothing more than nerves from being so far from home. But the deeper they went, the more palpable the feeling became. The air turned colder, and the wind picked up, a biting chill that seemed to press in on them from all sides. The forest surrounding them felt almost alive, like it was watching their every move, waiting for something. "Is anyone else feeling that?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping low as she looked around. Her gaze darted from shadow to shadow, her nerves beginning to fray. "Relax," Lisa said with a nervous laugh. "It's just a bit colder up here, nothing more." But the wind continued to howl, and the trees creaked as if they were straining against something unseen. The shadows shifted in ways that didn't make sense. The sound of their footsteps, crunching on the dry, brittle leaves and rocks, suddenly seemed far too loud, as if they were being followed by something that was aware of every move they made. Jake, trying to keep the mood light, grinned and waved his flashlight around in exaggerated motions. "Come on, guys. Don't be such babies. It's just a couple of trees and some rocks. We're not kids anymore, right?" But even as he spoke, his voice faltered slightly, and the others noticed. Mike, the quiet one, had stopped walking, staring out into the distance. His brow furrowed, and his lips were pressed tightly together. "Something's not right," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Oh, come on, Mike. Don't tell me you're starting to buy into these stupid stories," Lisa scoffed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in her voice. She was trying to sound tough, but even she couldn't deny that the night felt off. "Maybe we should turn back," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know about you guys, but I've got a bad feeling about this." The group paused, uncertainty spreading through them like a virus. They stood there for a few moments, the wind carrying a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if the land itself was alive, breathing, and angry. Jake rolled his eyes, trying to break the tension. All right. We'll head back, but just for a minute. Just to prove there's nothing to be afraid of." They turned around, but as they did, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder, and the shadows around them deepened, almost like they were being swallowed up by the night itself. The wind howled again, louder now, as if it were pushing them forward, urging them deeper into the hills. Then, without warning, a scream tore through the night, a sound that froze the blood in their veins. It was Sarah. She was standing a few paces ahead, her hands at her throat, her face contorted in terror as she backed away from something in the darkness. "Sarah?" Jake shouted, rushing toward her. But before he could take more than 2 steps, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. Sarah disappeared. Just like that. One moment, she was there, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide as she tried to scream. And the next moment, nothing. She was gone. No trace. No sound. As if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. The group froze. "Where did she go?" Lisa gasped, her voice breaking. "Where is she?" They looked around in a panic, shining their flashlights in every direction. But there was nothing. Nothing but the howling wind and the deep, oppressive silence that had fallen over the hills. Panic set in. "Sarah!" Jake shouted again, but his voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the hills. They called her name over and over, their voices trembling with fear, but there was no response. The hills had claimed her. They had no explanation for it. There were no tracks, no signs of struggle. Sarah had just vanished, swallowed up by the land itself. That's when the true horror began. The hills seemed to shift around them. The air grew colder, heavier, and the shadows seemed to move in unnatural ways. It was as if the land itself was alive, shifting and pulling them in, trapping them. They tried to run, but no matter how fast they moved, they couldn't escape. The hills weren't just a place. They were a living, breathing entity, and they were being hunted by it. Every direction they ran in seemed to bring them back to the same place, the same rocks, The same trees, the same path they had just walked on. It was as if the very earth beneath their feet was mocking them, trapping them in an endless loop of terror. The terror was not just the chase, it was the feeling of being watched. They couldn't see their pursuer, but they could feel it. It was in the way the shadows moved, in the rustling of the leaves, in the way the wind seemed to whisper their names. It was as if they were being stalked, hunted by something far older, far darker than they could ever understand. Jake, now frantic, stumbled over a rock, crashing to the ground. He looked up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and saw the faces of his friends. The terror in their eyes as they realized they weren't just running from something, they were running from everything. But no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape. The night was closing in. The hills were tightening their grip, and the cold, unrelenting presence that was Samuel, whether alive or something far worse, was closing in. The only thing they could feel was the certainty that they were being hunted. And as the darkness deepened, so did their terror. They had entered the realm of Samuel's domain, and they wouldn't leave the same. Or maybe they wouldn't leave at all. As the night wore on, the group was picked off, one by one, each victim falling prey to Samuel's sadistic games. The hills around them, once familiar and seemingly benign, had become a twisted maze, shifting and folding in on themselves, trapping them in an endless cycle of terror. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to the heart of the nightmare, yet further from any hope of escape. One by one, the group members vanished, without a trace. First, Mike, his screams echoed through the hills, then silence. Lisa, next, stumbled and fell, only to be swallowed by the shadows before her friends could reach her. Ben, ever the wild one, had tried to outrun the terror, his heart racing as he dashed through the hills, but in the end, he too was taken. And with each one, the darkness grew, the presence of Samuel growing stronger, suffocating them with the knowledge that they were not alone, that something far more terrible than any of them could comprehend was hunting them. Sarah was the last one left. Her heart pounded violently in her chest as she ran, her breath ragged and shallow. She could hear the footsteps behind her, always a little too close, always a little too quiet, like a predator stalking its prey. The sound grew louder with every step she took, a constant reminder that Samuel was watching, waiting for her to falter. His presence was suffocating, pressing down on her from all directions. She knew he was there, lurking just behind her, a ghost that seemed to glide through the night without making a sound. The hills seemed to stretch on forever, but no matter how far she ran, there was no escape. The landscape had shifted, twisted in a way that didn't make sense. She thought she had been running in a straight line, but when she looked around, everything felt wrong. The trees were too dark, the shadows too deep, and the wind, oh the wind, it carried with it whispers, faint voices calling her name,
but she couldn't stop. She couldn't look back. And then, as if fate itself had intervened, she saw it. Through the trees, through the swirling shadows, a silhouette, a structure, long forgotten, standing in the middle of the darkened hills. It was an old shack, barely more than a ruin, its wooden beams sagging with age. The roof was caved in, the walls rotting with time. But to Sarah, it was a sign, a place to hide. She thought maybe, just maybe, if she could reach it, if she could lock herself inside, she might be able to get away, to escape whatever madness Samuel had brought to these hills. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she pushed herself forward, moving as fast as she could, driven by the desperate hope that this was her chance to survive. The shack loomed closer and closer, its door hanging loosely on its hinges, beckoning her like a final refuge. She reached it, her hand trembling as she grabbed the door and pushed it open. The hinges creaked loudly in the stillness, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world had gone silent. Inside was dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight that filtered through the broken windows. The air smelled stale and fetid, thick with the scent of decay. Sarah stepped cautiously into the room, her senses on high alert. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and that's when she saw it. The walls were covered in bloodstains, dark, deep red patches that stained the once white wood. The air reeked of death, of something far worse than decay. And then, in the center of the room, she saw it. A table, large, wooden, and stained with blood, its surface marred with scratches and marks that suggested it had been used for something far more sinister than any ordinary piece of furniture. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she realized the truth of what she was looking at. This was not just an abandoned shack. It was Samuel's lair. This was where he had taken his victims. This was where he had made them suffer. A cold chill ran down her spine as the realization hit her. She was no longer just running from him. She had stumbled right into his den. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound deafening in the silence, and Sarah whipped around, panic rising in her chest. But it was too late. Samuel's voice echoed through the room, low and menacing. It reverberated off the walls, sending a shiver through her entire body. "You thought you could escape?" Her heart stopped for a moment, the air around her turning suffocating. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt his presence in the room with her, so close she could almost feel his breath on her skin. But she couldn't see him. She couldn't see anything except the dark shadows that filled the room, closing in on her from all sides. She tried to run, to scream, to fight, but her limbs felt heavy, as though they were no longer her own. The walls seemed to press in on her, the floor shifting beneath her feet, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. Her mind was racing, frantic, but no matter how fast she moved, no matter how much she tried to escape, she couldn't find the door. The room seemed to change shape, becoming a maze of darkness and shadows that trapped her in its cold, unyielding grip. And then everything went black. No screams, no final words,
just darkness, a void so deep, so consuming that it swallowed her whole. And with that, Sarah was gone. The last of her friends had vanished into the night, consumed by Samuel's madness, and no one would ever see her again. No one would ever know what had happened to her in those final moments. The hills had claimed her, just as they had claimed the others. As for the rest of the group, their bodies were never found. Not a single trace remained of the 5 friends who had ventured into the hills that night, foolishly thinking they could escape the legend, that they could challenge the terror that Samuel had become. The only thing that remained were the rumors, the stories passed down through generations, the whispers of the horrors that had occurred in the hills surrounding Edgewood. Some say Samuel still walks those hills, his dark presence lingering like a shadow over the land, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far. The hills, once a place of natural beauty, had become a twisted domain, a place where the line between life and death was as thin as a breath. If you ever find yourself near Edgewood and the wind whispers your name, remember the legend. Remember what happened to those who dared to challenge it. Don't look back. Because if you do, you might just meet the last kill.